This is the Bloomberg Daybreak, your podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 12th of June in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the French Finance Minister warns of a Liz Truss-type debt crisis if Marine Le Pen's party wins upcoming parliamentary elections.
Conservatives tell Bloomberg they believe there's little chance Rishi Sunak's manifesto tax cuts will shift the polls.
Plus, as Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's star keeps rising internationally, problems lurk back home. We have a special report.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
France's finance minister has warned that his country could face a Liz Truss scenario of bond market turmoil if the far right were to win this month's parliamentary elections. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
Speaking at a campaign event, Bruno Le Maire suggested policies the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen have supported in the past, like cutting VAT or reducing the retirement age, could cost billions of euros. His comments follow French President Emmanuel Macron's decision to call snap elections after his party was trounced by Le Pen's in European Parliament voting on Sunday. Prime Minister Gabriel Attal and the President of the National Assembly, Yael Braun-Pivet, are both opposed to the move, according to a person familiar with their thinking. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
In the UK, Rishi Sunak's own party took aim at his manifesto, saying there is little chance that it will shift opinion polls ahead of the 4th of July. Bloomberg was told by multiple Conservatives on the left and right wings of the party that their election pitch lacks game-changing policies. The Prime Minister had a message for sceptics at the manifesto launch.
I'm not blind to the fact that people are frustrated with our party and frustrated with me. Things have not always been easy, and we have not got everything right. But we are the only party in this election with the big ideas to make our country a better place to live.
Rishi Sunak's policy platform includes plans to cut national insurance tax, save £12 billion by cutting welfare spending, and a boost to defence spending.
Labour Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves says the Conservatives' desperate policies put the UK economy at risk.
If they did believe that their sums added up, if they thought that they would get the all clear from the Office of Budget Responsibility, they wouldn't have put these plans in a manifesto. They would have put them in a budget. They know their numbers don't add up.
Reeves will launch her rival manifesto tomorrow. It comes as former Labour leader Neil Kinnock has told Bloomberg his party would be wise not to overpromise on ruling out tax rises. He says the party, which is widely polled to be the next government, needs fiscal room for manoeuvre.
Bloomberg understands that the EU is poised to delay key parts of global bank capital rules by a year. The decision was reportedly taken to avoid putting European lenders at a disadvantage to their US counterparts because of wrangling over plans to make Wall Street banks hold more capital, which are not yet finalised. Known as Basel III, the regulations are designed to prevent a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis, but they are already running 2 years behind schedule. The EU was due to implement the rules on the 1st of January.
The Federal Reserve is expected to hold interest rates steady today, a decision that will come just hours after May's CPI reading. The Fed will be looking for evidence that inflation is still moving down towards its 2% target, but markets will also be closely watching the projections for future inflation as part of the dot plot. Here's Citadel's global hell of rate trading, Michael DePass.
The focus really will be on the FOMC, and in particular, what does the dot plot show for the number of expected cuts for the rest of this year? That number has obviously come down materially over the course of this year, and the market's split between, I think, somewhere between 1 and 2 cuts. So there'll be a little bit of a reaction, whatever the outcome.
Michael DePass says he's also cautious about putting too much faith in the Fed's outlook beyond this year. We'll bring you the US CPI data live at 1:30pm London time, followed by this Fed decision at 7pm, with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell set to speak 30 minutes later.
The US is considering further restrictions on China's access to the chip technology used for artificial intelligence. Bloomberg has learnt the measures would limit the country's ability to use chip architecture known as gate-all-around, which promises to make semiconductors more powerful. Companies including Nvidia and Intel are looking to start using the design next year. Bloomberg's Nick Turner says that these potential sanctions aren't the same as previous restrictions.
It's a little different than the earlier ones that really kind of focused on advanced chips, such as what NVIDIA sells or chip-making equipment that's used to make it. This is really kind of trying to go after a chip architecture that's still kind of cutting edge and just being commercialized now and put into chips. It has potential to make chips more powerful and especially when they're applied to tasks like AI.
Our senior technology editor, Nick Turner, speaking there. President Biden is also expanding restrictions on the sale of chips and other technology to Russia, targeting third-party sellers in China and elsewhere. An announcement on that is expected today. Now, in a moment, we'll get more on the French election, plus focus on the rise of Italy's Prime Minister as Giorgia Meloni prepares to host the G7 Leaders Summit. But another story that caught our eye this morning, as we've been thinking about the looming elections in the UK and France, this is Lionel Laurent, who's been writing about TikTok and his experience on the app when he's been seeking out political content.
So, I mean, it was a bit of a thought experiment, I think, for Lionel. He downloaded the app, signed up. First thing he looked for was Emmanuel Macron's official feed, watched a video of that, and then he just let the algorithm take him to whatever their suggested content was after that. And he says that it took him down what can only be described as a very Putin-friendly rabbit hole. The first video said in bold letters that Macron had declared war on Russia by offering to train military instructors in Ukraine, while others attacked him for not inviting Russia to D-Day ceremonies. And it sort of snowballed from there in terms of how disturbing the content got. Now, Lionel then contacted TikTok, who said the videos that he'd seen did breach their guidelines and they took them down. But this is, as Lionel points out in the piece, the pressure, it shows the pressure that's on the controls against disinformation on a platform like this, despite the fact they have thousands of people working on this. And he said it would be ludicrous for us to blame just technology for polarisation in democracy or for misinformation, you know, which has been around for a long time before social media exploded. But he points to the dangers, the fact that more, particularly young people, are getting their news from TikTok, and the idea that, you know, a democracy benefits from an informed electorate and responsible speech. It's hard to shrug it off as neutral either, that there is this much disinformation floating around such a popular social media network. Yeah,
absolutely. And look, it's about quantity and speed, isn't it? In terms of mis and disinformation. But obviously in a year of such closely watched elections and so many of them around the world, I think this is going to be the year that is going to be widely analysed. I mean, obviously in the UK election campaign, of course, you know, all of the campaigning is online, but it takes time actually to understand what messages are hitting on social media. But it's pretty fascinating. I mean, even the Conservatives in the election manifesto yesterday were talking about a ban, or one of their pledges being a ban on phones for kids in schools. So you can start to see the social media impact actually in election campaigning.
Look, we've just skimmed the surface of what Lionel got into in the piece, but it's well worth a look. A day down TikTok's disinformation rabbit hole. You'll find it at bloomberg.com/opinion.
Now, the French election campaign, of course, is heating up after Emmanuel Macron's surprise announcement of a snap poll on Sunday night. Later today, the president will officially launch his party's election campaign, as the first poll indicates that he's trailing the far-right party of Marine Le Pen. Stephen, this is obviously a story that you've been following closely. You know, a long-time resident of France. You've looked at the politics for so many years. It's been a very rough start to the campaign, though, for President Macron's party by the looks of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the announcement caught almost everyone, it seems, off guard, including some within Macron's own party, and they're having to get back into campaign mode after a particularly bruising campaign that they've had for the European elections as well. And this time around, many of those in the party are at risk of losing their own seats as well. And what we've been learning since the announcement is that some of the most senior figures in the Renaissance Party were opposed to the president's call to do this. One source telling Bloomberg that Prime Minister Gabriel Attal and the President of the National Assembly Yael Braun-Pivet were also opposed to it. Now, Braun-Pivet actually saying in an interview that there were other options to calling an election, looking at things like coalitions that the president could have taken. One MP telling us that it was like Macron sending them into battle. The first poll that we've heard since the announcement won't help these things as well. It puts the far-right party of the National Rally of Marine Le Pen on 35% of the vote in the first round of the election. Macron and his allies on around 18%. The left-wing parties, if they all got together, would have around 25% of the vote as well. There's, of course, a margin of error in this as well. It's also worth remembering that there's a two-round election system in France. So you poll the first round, makes it much more difficult to predict how the parties align themselves for runoffs that'll happen in most constituencies constituencies a week later.
OK, that's interesting. But it's not just MPs, as you've mentioned, a number who are worried. It's also the markets who are looking more sceptically. They've certainly taken fright to some extent.
Yeah, the sell-off we've seen on Monday continued on Tuesday. The yield on 10-year French bonds, known as OATs, jumped by as much as 10 basis points. The spread over German bonds, a safe haven in Europe, widened to the highest level, or to the widest level rather, since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic on a closing basis. We saw a sell-off at Italian bonds as well. So that's indicating the potential risk that investors are seeing affecting broader Europe too. Equities down for a second day, a 2-day decline of 2.7%. That's the biggest in a year. This is what Bruno Le Maire was talking about when he spoke at that event in his former constituency in northern France. He says the policies the National Rally Party have put forward in the past, things like lowering the retirement age back to 60 in France, cutting VAT, for example, would cost hundreds of billions of euros. That's where he drew the comparison to Liz Truss, by the way, and the gilt market crisis here in 2022, saying a Liz Truss scenario is possible. We should expect to hear more of this from Macron's party during this campaign as well, between now and the first round on the 30th of June. But remember that Macron's own party have struggled at fiscal consolidation as well. We're expected to get the European Commission's verdict on France's public finances when finance ministers meet on the 19th of June. That's going to be a topic of discussion there as well. That could come at a very bad time. The latest economic forecast from the Bank of France not providing much comfort. They're seeing growth this year of 0.8%, and they've downgraded the growth forecast for the next 2 years as well.
OK, so that on the economy of France. I mean, we will hear from Macron later. I mean, briefly on that, the idea, he's been in power, 7 years? There are rumours potentially that he might step down if the elections go badly.
This was part of the market turmoil we saw yesterday. There was a report on one French media organisation that he was considering stepping down if the results didn't go his way. He then spoke to Le Figaro after that as well, saying that that wasn't the case. His position won't be affected by the result of these elections. He says that the institutions are clear, so is the place of the president, whatever the result. He says that it's not the National Rally that writes the constitution. That doesn't mean that he's not under pressure, though. We may see him face more questions like this later as well when he holds that press conference, and that's really his position is one of the key questions being watched internationally. If the National Rally were to win this election, how does that affect Macron's position on the international stage and crucially within the European Union, where he's expected to play a leading role in the choreography that's playing out in Brussels over the next top jobs in the EU? Yeah,
absolutely. Well, should we turn our attention then to that, Stephen, because the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is preparing to host G7 leaders in Apulia, of which Macron is one, of course. But while she's focusing on the international stage, there are problems lurking for her back home with allies that she can't quite trust and an economy operating on borrowed time. This, as we speak to our Italian politics correspondent Donato Paolo Mancini, who's joining us now from Rome and who's been writing about the challenges facing Giorgia Meloni, another key player in Europe. Good morning, Donato. Giorgia Meloni is at the forefront of international events. Tell us about what has brought her to this point. I mean, now that she's been leader for a couple of years in Italy.
Thanks so much for having me. Good morning. So we actually just published a story this morning that talks about how she has this incredible allure and how her rising star, how her star keeps rising internationally. She's getting ready to host the G7 leaders of summit of leaders in Puglia, which is where I am. I'm not actually in Rome. And she basically has this very strong reputation abroad, and she's worked really, really hard to attain it. She's brought on board people that were highly skeptical of her, like Macron, like Scholz. These people were intensely skeptical of her origins in the hard right, essentially. And now she's become this very swift, able, capable diplomatic operator. She's able to speak to everyone across political divides in the EU. But at the same time, there are issues lurking in the background. And the two main issues are the economy, which is Italy's eternal problem in a way. Italy has an immense public debt that is projected to keep expanding. It has a deficit, which the European Union will soon put under the microscope, turning the attention to the dysfunctional economy of the country. And she's surrounded by people that she doesn't quite trust, that she respects, but doesn't quite trust enough to delegate to, perhaps. And And that has directly to do with the fact that she is a very tribalistic politician.
So how important is the G7 meeting for her then?
It's make or break, essentially. I think she knows. So Giorgia Meloni was voted in 2 years ago. She had been in opposition for a long time, had been seen as a fringe politician belonging to the hard right. 2 years ago, Italians catapulted her to the top of the polls, made her prime minister. She is, in a way, a figure that doesn't belong to the establishment. She is from a working class background. She didn't go to university, for example, and these are things that she wears with pride. And the problem is that now, essentially, she knows that this kind of juncture of events is coming at her. You have the economy that's not going well in the European Union that will soon turn its attention to what Italy's doing with the money. And so she needs all the goodwill she can muster. And she essentially needs the G7 to kind of cement this reputation as a swift diplomatic operator who's able to speak to everyone and who can be trusted, essentially. Because if difficult political decisions are coming down the line and that's seen as essentially a certainty from the sources that we've spoken to, then she will need a lot of leeway to keep both her voters happy, but her allies happy as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see the sort of the parallels between France and Italy, or the comparisons between Giorgia Meloni and potentially Marine Le Pen about whether, you know, a far-right leader can moderate and can operate in government. I mean, in terms of Italy specifically, though, some of the issues that you're talking about debt and leadership and the role within Europe, I mean, those aren't new.
No, those aren't exactly new. That's a very good observation. I mean, there's one thing to say, which is I think that Giorgia Meloni kind of has softened her stance on many things. She's become an orthodox in foreign policy. She is completely mainstream for certain things. So I think government has softened her. There was another figure that was as charismatic as her, whose main, I mean, there were several headaches for this person, and it's Silvio Berlusconi, the late Silvio Berlusconi, who founded Forza Italia back in the 90s. And his government ended abruptly in 2011 because of debt. Now, to be completely clear and to be sure, we're not in the same situation. Italy has stabilized its debt. It stabilized the spread, which is a differential with German sovereign debt, essentially, that gives investors a measure of how sustainable it is in the long term. But the problems are still the same. The structural issues within Italy in its economy are still the same. And it seems like every leader that surpasses the 2-year mark at some point has to deal with them. And so what Giorgia Meloni is trying to do now, she's trying to kind of use the strategy that she's used to kind of soften her stance on diplomatic issues and foreign policy by saying, well, the problem with debt is that because of Italy's structure of power, essentially, we keep having governments that are unstable. And so I want to make the prime minister's office, the prime minister's position more powerful. Therefore, if you make me more powerful, she will need a referendum to do this most likely, then debt will likely go down, which is I think, a very interesting experiment and testament to her political skills, I think.
Yeah. I mean, does she have the political capital to be able to pull off something like that? Because, you know, as you say, we're used to the instability that leaders can face kind of all of a sudden. So can Giorgia Meloni pull something like that off?
That's a good question. Look, if you look at her peers, I think she's the only one that's emerged from the European election over the weekend with on the front foot, right? There's been a massive political earthquake across Europe. Whereas Italians voting for the European Parliament essentially said, look, we're happy with the status quo. Sure, let's give Giorgia Meloni a couple more percentage points in the polls. The opposition has also surged, but it's still second. It's still the runner-up. So I think she might actually have the political stability to do that internally. And I think what matters to her now is that she gets that goodwill solidified in Europe. So when she needs the leeway necessary to keep her voters happy, but also kind of keep her allies happy, she's got kind of the groundwork to do that, essentially.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.